So today we're diving into the final, frantic, and frankly fascinating last years of the Western Roman Empire. This isn't a story about a glorious end. It's about an empire that was already a ghost, crumbling from the inside out, filled with ambition, betrayal, and one last-ditch effort to turn back the clock.
Just look at this. In only 20 years, Rome burned through 9 emperors. And look at how they went out. Stoned, murdered, executed, deposed. This isn't a stable line of succession. It's a bloodbath. It's what happens when the system is completely broken. This chaos was the new normal, the death rattle of a once mighty empire.
And by this point, calling yourself emperor was, well, it was mostly for show. The empire was a hollowed-out shell. Its breadbasket, North Africa, was gone, snapped up by the Vandals. And get this, the Vandals now had a navy and controlled the Mediterranean, choking Rome's trade. The irony. For an empire born on defeating Carthage at sea, this was a bitter pill. On top of that, the treasury was completely empty. The state was flat broke.
But you know, even in the darkest of times, sometimes a hero emerges, a last flicker of the old Roman spirit. And that brings us to Act 1, Rome's last true hero.
That man was Majorian, and he wasn't just another guy in a purple robe. The legendary historian Edward Gibbon described him as this great and heroic character, someone who was a throwback to a better time. He was seen as a man of virtue, a genuine leader, who actually wanted to save the state, not just carve out a piece for himself. And he didn't just have vague ideas, he had a real, comprehensive plan. Look at this. It wasn't just about war. He started with the foundations. Fix the finances by forgiving old tax debt to help the people. Stop the cities from literally tearing down their history for building materials. Go after corrupt officials. And only then, with a stronger base, would he go for the final goal. Build a fleet and take back Africa.
And he wasn't messing around. To get this done, he launched this incredible shipbuilding program. He had the forests of the Apennines cut down, brought the old shipyards back to life, and built a fleet of 300 large warships. A monumental effort, all aimed at one thing, crushing the Vandals in Carthage.
And it all came to nothing. His massive fleet was ambushed and destroyed, thanks to traitors in his own camp. The failure was a stain on his reputation, and his own general, a man named Ricimer, saw his chance. He stirred up a revolt, Majorian was forced to abdicate, and he was dead 5 days later. Just like that, Rome's last best hope was extinguished.
So who was this general who betrayed him? That brings us to Act 2, and the man who was the real power behind the throne for the next 2 decades, the puppet master, Ricimer.
This really breaks it down, doesn't it? There was the emperor, and then there was the man with the power. The emperor got the fancy robe and the palace, he was the public face. But Ricimer, he had the army, he had the money. He was the one who decided who got to be emperor and for how long. Because of his barbarian heritage, he could never wear the purple himself, but that didn't matter. He was the kingmaker.
After Majorian, Ricimer learned his lesson. Never pick a strong emperor again. From then on, he ruled through a series of nobodies, guys he could control. He treated the imperial throne like it was his to give and to take away. He wasn't serving the empire, he was its absolute master. And his ego was off the charts. Just listen to this. When people begged him to make peace with the Emperor Anthemius, who was his own father-in-law, by the way, this was his response. He's basically saying, why should I make peace? You should be begging me for forgiveness. It shows you exactly how he saw himself, not as a subject, but as a power unto himself.
But there was one last grand attempt to save the West. This time, it wasn't just Italy. It was a massive joint operation with the still powerful Eastern Roman Empire. This was the Hail Mary. The scale of this thing was just mind-boggling. The Eastern Empire alone spent 130,000 pounds of gold. That is a truly colossal amount of money. They were betting the entire treasury on one single operation to finally get rid of the Vandal threat for good.
And to put the force in perspective, remember Majorian's impressive fleet of 300 ships? Yeah, this one completely dwarfs it. We're talking over 1,000 ships, 100,000 soldiers and sailors.
This was, without a doubt, the single largest military operation of the entire late Roman period,
And it ended in an even bigger catastrophe. The commander, a guy named Basiliscus, was either a traitor or completely incompetent. He gave the Vandals a 5-day truce, which they used to wait for the wind to change. Then they just sent a bunch of fire ships, basically floating bombs, right into the heart of the crowded Roman fleet. The entire armada was wiped out, destroyed, in one night.
Now here's the devastating irony. With the external threat of the Vandals gone, what did the Romans do? They turned on each other. Ricimer, now with no one to keep him in check, marches on Rome itself, hunts down the emperor, his own father-in-law Anthemius, and has him dragged out and murdered in the street.
Ricimer actually died of a disease not long after, but the damage was done. The Western Empire was finished as a real power. And that brings us to our final act, an empire on paper. At this point, being emperor is nothing more than a title.
The pretense, the whole charade, was finally dropped. The next general to take power, a Roman named Orestes, didn't even bother finding some obscure senator to be his puppet. No, he just put his own teenage son on the throne. And here is one of history's greatest, most poignant ironies. The very last emperor of the West just so happened to have the name Romulus, after the legendary founder of the city, and Augustulus, a diminutive of Augustus, the very first emperor. The beginning and the end all rolled into one name. You just can't write this stuff.
So, if the emperor isn't in charge, who is? It's these guys, the Confederates. These were the foreign mercenaries, Goths, Huns, Alans, who made up the actual army in Italy. They'd served Rome for generations, but by now they were fully aware that they were the ones with the swords. They held the real power.
The final straw wasn't a foreign invasion. It was basically a pay dispute. The army demands a retirement plan. They want to be given 1/3 of all the land in Italy. Orestes refuses. He sides with the wealthy Italian landowners over his own troops. And, well, that was a fatal mistake. The army revolted, killed him, and elected one of their own, Odoacer, as their new leader.
And so here we are, the very end of the line. The story of the final emperor, and the quiet, almost anticlimactic moment the Western Roman Empire officially blinked out of existence.
Odoacer gets rid of the boy emperor Romulus Augustulus, but he doesn't name a new emperor. He doesn't even take the title himself. Instead, he tells the Roman Senate to send a letter to the Eastern Emperor Zeno in Constantinople. And this letter basically says, you know what? We don't really need one of these over here anymore. One emperor is plenty. And they literally boxed up the imperial robes and crown and mailed them east.
History books tell us that 476 AD is the year Rome fell. But Odoacer's move wasn't really a conquest. It was just an admission of what was already true, which leaves us with this question. If an empire has no real territory, no money, no army, and now no emperor, hasn't it already fallen? Maybe 476 wasn't the fall of Rome at all. Maybe it was just the moment someone finally admitted the empire was already long gone.
Today, we're diving into one of history's great turning points, the end of the Roman Empire. According to the legendary historian Edward Gibbon, as that old world crumbled, it wasn't just armies that reshaped the future. It was two powerful religious movements. One was a revolution from within, and the other, an invasion of faith from the outside. And together, well, they would change everything. For Gibbon, the answer wasn't just about political chaos. It was about a deep, profound spiritual crisis. He argued that out of this decay, two incredible forces rose up to fill the void. The first was an internal revolution of belief. The second was an external wave of conversion that brought with it a brand new, violent conflict. Let's start with the world they were all trying to escape. So let's set the scene. We're in the 4th century, and the Roman Empire is in serious trouble. And for a lot of people, the official, state-sanctioned version of Christianity just felt hollow. It left behind this deep spiritual hunger. Into this spiritual vacuum stepped a new, really radical kind of believer, the ascetic Christian. Now, these were not your everyday churchgoers. They believed that true faith meant waging an all-out war on the world and on yourself. This created a brand new, stark division. You had the ordinary faithful, just living their lives, And then you had these spiritual extremists who wanted to escape life itself. Gibbon, with his famously skeptical eye, he really tried to get inside their heads. He didn't see their motivation as some gentle piety. No, he called it a savage enthusiasm. A worldview where humanity is basically criminal, the world is a trap, and God is a kind of tyrant who can only be appeased if you punish yourself. So what do you do when you believe the world is corrupt and your own body is the enemy? You run. And that single impulse, that desire to flee, it sparked our first great revolution, the birth of Christian monasticism. Their path was as simple as it was brutal. Step 1, you renounce everything that the world considers a pleasure. Good food, wine, family, even just basic comfort. Step 2, you actively punish the body through starvation, isolation, and pain. And the goal? The ultimate goal was that through this life of chosen misery, you might finally earn eternal happiness. This whole movement just exploded, thanks to leaders like Antony of Egypt. Around 305 AD, he literally just walked away from his life and went into the desert to live in a ruined fort. This one radical act was like a spark hitting gasoline. Before you know it, thousands of followers were creating these huge hermit communities all across the deserts of Egypt and Syria, all dedicated to this extreme new way of life. And the movement reached these almost superhuman extremes. The most famous example? A Syrian hermit named Simeon Stylites. He builds a 60-foot pillar, climbs on top of it, and just stays there for 30 years, exposed to the elements, praying endlessly. This completely bizarre display of faith made him one of the most famous people in the entire Roman world. But was this explosion in popularity really all about piety? Gibbon, ever the skeptic, suggested a much more cynical motive. You know, in a collapsing empire, a monastery wasn't just a path to salvation. It was also a perfect way to escape crushing taxes, grinding poverty, and being forced into military service. And this brings us to the great paradox of the whole thing. These men, who fled the world to get away from power and wealth, suddenly found themselves wielding it. Their reputation for holiness became a kind of currency, and it was so valuable that communities would literally drag these hermits out of their caves and force them onto the thrones of powerful, wealthy bishops. So while this spiritual revolution was transforming the empire from within, a second one was happening right at the gates, the conversion of the so-called barbarian tribes, who were busy carving up the Western Empire for themselves. A key figure here was a man named Ulfilas, the apostle to the Goths. He took on this monumental task of translating the Bible into their language, and in the process, he basically had to invent their written script. But he made one very strategic choice. He left out the bloody books of Kings. Apparently, he was worried that his fierce new converts might find all those stories of war a little too inspiring. But here's the critical twist. The Christianity these tribes adopted was not the same Christianity of Rome. They became followers of Arianism, a belief system that the mainstream Orthodox Catholic Church had already condemned as a dangerous heresy. Now, this dispute might seem really subtle to us today, but to them it was everything. The whole question was this: was Jesus the Son equal to God the Father, made of the very same divine stuff? The Orthodox Catholics, the Athanasians, they said yes. The Arians said no. The Son was created by the Father, and therefore he was subordinate. And this single disagreement would end up fueling centuries of hatred. And this wasn't some little fringe belief. As the Western Empire fractured, Arianism actually became the state religion for almost all of the new powers on the block. The Goths, the Vandals, the Burgundians, they were all Arians, and they were all establishing kingdoms on what used to be Roman soil. This created a massive religious fault line right across the map of Europe. And this was not a live and let live kind of situation. This division between Arian and Catholic didn't lead to some new understanding. It ignited a new and particularly vicious kind of war. A war where your enemy wasn't just a foreigner, but a heretic. The most brutal flashpoint for this conflict was the Vandal kingdom in North Africa. There, you had this small ruling class of Arian Vandals governing a huge population of Catholic Romans. For the Vandal kings, this was an unacceptable threat, and they decided they were going to resolve it with pure force. The Vandal king Huneric unleashed this systematic and really cruel persecution. In one infamous case, he rounded up thousands of Catholic men, women, and children just for refusing to convert. And their punishment? A forced march into the desolate Sahara Desert. The number of exiles was 4,996, a virtual death sentence. These brutal persecutions led to these incredible stories of defiance and, according to the sources, outright miracles. A bishop named Victor of Vida recorded the fate of a group of Catholics in a town called Tipasa. After they refused to convert, the authorities had their right hands cut off and their tongues torn out by the roots. And yet, Victor writes, they could still speak perfectly. Now, I know what you're thinking. That sounds like a pious legend, right? But Gibbon highlights this incredible detail. The story was actually verified by a credible outside witness. A traveling philosopher named Aeneas of Gaza met these men in Constantinople. He wrote that he personally looked inside their mouths and confirmed, in total astonishment, that their tongues had been completely torn away, and yet he heard them speak. This religious hatred wasn't just political, it was deeply personal, and it poisoned even royal families. In the Visigothic court of Spain, the Arian queen Goisvintha just flew into a rage at her 13-year-old Catholic daughter-in-law. For refusing to convert, the queen grabbed the young princess, threw her to the ground, and just kicked her until she was bleeding. In the end, though, Arianism just couldn't hold out. Through a mix of military defeat, political pressure, and sheer diplomacy, the Arian kingdoms were either conquered by Catholic powers like the Franks, or their kings just chose to convert. By the year 700, the Arian heresy that had defined an entire era of war had all but vanished from Europe. When Gibbon looked back on this entire period, he saw a complete and total transformation. The world of emperors and philosophers had been completely replaced by a world of pillar saints and warring Christian kings. As he put it, a truly memorable revolution had taken place, one that reshaped the very soul of Europe. And all this leaves us with a really challenging question. The monks fled the world to save their souls, but in doing so, they arguably helped drain the empire of its strength. The barbarians adopted a new faith to join a civilization, but their version of that faith plunged Europe into religious war. Which forces us to ask, can the very forces that save a people's soul also be the ones that break their world? You know, when a massive empire collapses, what comes next? What rises from the ashes? Today, we're jumping right into that chaos. We're looking at the bloody, fascinating birth of the European kingdoms, and we're zeroing in on one man, a Frankish warlord named Clovis, who literally carved a nation out of the ruins of Roman Gaul. Now listen to this. These words, they're from a Roman commander, and it was a warning, a chilling warning, given to the people of Gaul centuries before the empire actually fell. He told them, look, if Rome goes down, don't expect freedom. Expect to be consumed by, and I quote, the eternal hostilities of the barbarian conquerors. And you know what? As we're about to see, that wasn't just a prediction. It came true, down to the letter. All right, so the Western Roman Empire is gone. It's just dissolved. And in its place, especially in Gaul, which, is basically modern-day France, there's this enormous power vacuum. But this isn't just some political mess. No, what we're looking at here is a full-blown clash of civilizations. And the contrast is just, wow. It's so stark. On one side, you've got the Gallo-Romans. These guys are the heirs to Roman civilization, right? They're speaking Latin, they're reading Cicero, they're living this polished, comfortable life. But, and this is a huge but, 400 years of being protected by Roman legions has, as the historian Edward Gibbon put it, just melted away their courage. They've gone soft. Then, on the other side, you have the Germanic tribes pouring over the Rhine River. They're described as these ferocious, untamed warriors, but they're also completely disorganized, politically speaking. So what you have is this incredible collision, a culture that's forgotten how to fight, crashing right into a people who seem to live for nothing else. So, Into this total chaos steps our main guy, a young, ambitious, and, let's be honest, utterly ruthless Frankish prince named Clovis. And where everyone else sees ruin, he sees one thing: opportunity. And get this, he was just a kid. He becomes king of the Salian Franks when he's only 15 years old. 15. And the kingdom he inherits? It's tiny, up around modern-day Belgium. And his army is just a few thousand warriors. That is not exactly what you'd call the foundation for an empire. Yeah, he basically started with nothing. No gold in the bank, no supplies in the warehouses. But here's where his genius kicks in. He understood, but in this new, brutal world, real power didn't come from a fancy title or owning land. It came from the blade of a sword. And, kind of like Julius Caesar had done in those exact same lands centuries earlier, Clovis paid for his wars with, well, more war. He paid his soldiers with whatever they could take from the people they conquered. And his rise was just meteoric. I mean, within a few short years of taking charge, boom, he defeats Syagrius, the last so-called king of the Romans in Gaul. A decade after that, he absolutely crushes a rival German tribe, the Alemanni, in this incredibly desperate battle. Then he just turns his army south and boots the Visigoths out of Aquitaine. Think about that. In a little over 20 years, this teenage kid with a small band of warriors had become the master of Gaul. But here's the thing. For all his military skill, Clovis's greatest weapon wasn't his battle axe. It was his brain. And the single most decisive move of his entire reign, well, it had nothing to do with fighting on a battlefield. It had everything to do with faith. And this brings us to the absolute core question of his entire reign, right? When Clovis converts to Christianity, what was really going on? Was it a genuine, heartfelt conversion, maybe sparked by his Catholic wife, Clotilda? Or was it maybe the single most calculated, cynical, and flat-out brilliant political move of his life? Well, let's look at the politics of it, because they were huge. By converting specifically to Catholic Christianity, Clovis instantly transformed himself. He became the champion of the huge Gallo-Roman population, who were, guess what, also Catholic. He immediately got the powerful bishops on his side, and they were really the only organized authority left in the cities. It was like building a bridge between the Frankish conquerors and their Roman subjects. And on top of all that, it gave him the perfect religious excuse to attack his rivals, the Goths, the Burgundians, because he could just call them heretics for following a different type of Christianity. And if you want a window into his soul, this quote says it all. The story goes that a bishop is telling him about the crucifixion, Christ's peaceful sacrifice. Clovis doesn't sit there and think about salvation or forgiveness. Nope. His reaction is immediate and it's furious. It's the reaction of a warlord. He just hears about an injustice done to a leader, and his first instinct, his only instinct, is violent revenge. That tells you everything you need to know. He was a conqueror first, and a convert a very distant second. But let's be clear. Behind this new public image of the pious Christian king, there was a much, much darker reality. Clovis knew that to build a kingdom that would actually last, it wasn't enough to just defeat your enemies. You had to eliminate them completely. I mean, just think about how chilling this is. Gibbon tells us that Clovis would literally go from presiding over a church meeting with all the bishops, playing the part of the Holy King, and then he'd calmly and systematically have all of his own relatives assassinated. All of them. Every other Frankish king and prince who could possibly challenge him. His entire reign was basically one long violation of the very Christian values he claimed to uphold in public. So what did all this violence and cunning actually create? Well, something totally new. This wasn't just another barbarian kingdom that would fizzle out. It was a fusion, a hybrid. You had the raw, brutal military power of the Germanic tribes sort of grafted onto the old administrative skeleton of the Roman Empire, and the glue holding the whole thing together, the Catholic Church. This powerful, strange new model, it would become the blueprint for pretty much all the nations of medieval Europe. Okay, so you've got this new hybrid society. Naturally, it's going to need a new set of rules. And the laws that the Franks put in place, man, they perfectly reflected this new pecking order. What you end up with is a legal system that was, well, often bizarre, definitely brutal and completely, explicitly unequal. And this new hierarchy wasn't just some social thing. It was written right into the law. For a lot of crimes, the punishment was a fine, what they called a blood price. But how much you paid or how much you were worth depended entirely on who you were. So check this out. The life of a top-tier Frankish noble? 600 gold pieces. A Roman noble? Worth only half that, 300. An ordinary Frank? 200. And a lower-class Roman? You could kill one of them and get away with it for as little as 50 gold pieces. The law itself was screaming that the lives of the conquerors were worth more than the lives of the conquered. So what about when there was no proof? How did they figure out who was guilty? Well, they often just left it up to the judgment of God. This meant the accused had to go through a trial by ordeal. And this stuff is wild. We're talking about plunging your hand into boiling water or being forced to carry a piece of red-hot iron. The thinking was if your wound healed up super fast, without infection, that was a miracle. It meant God himself had declared you innocent. It was a legal system based entirely on superstition, not a shred of evidence. Now, to really grasp how significant all this was in Gaul, it actually helps to look next door, at Britain. Because over there, when the Roman Empire collapsed, things played out in a completely different and much more destructive way. And the difference is just staggering. In Gaul, you have Clovis and the Franks, who, for all their violence, eventually fused with the Roman population. They took on their religion, they adapted their government, but in Britain, the invading Angles and Saxons did the exact opposite. It seems like they waged a war of total extermination, just wiping the Roman way of life off the map. The language, the laws, Christianity, all of it gone, extirpated, as Gibbon says. It led to what he called a general desolation. So you have two former Roman provinces and two totally different outcomes. And right there, you have the seeds of the very different histories of France and England. So in the end, the foundation of what would become France was laid by a man who was, somehow, both a pious Christian convert and a cold-blooded killer. He built a nation using this brutal cocktail of military genius, shrewd political maneuvering, and, let's face it, religious opportunism. And that leaves us with one last big question to chew on. What does this incredibly violent and complicated story tell us about what it really takes to create a new world from the ashes of an old one?
All right, let's dive into one of the biggest questions in all of history. Why did Rome fall? But here's the twist. We're going to look at it through the eyes of the guy who literally wrote the book on it, Edward Gibbon. And he starts by telling us we've been asking the wrong question from the very beginning.
So Gibbon kicks off his massive, famous work. And what does he do? He doesn't give you an answer. No, he totally flips the script. He says the real mystery isn't why Rome collapsed. The real miracle, the thing we should be surprised by, is how this absolute behemoth of an empire lasted for over 1,000 years. For Gibbon, the seeds of his destruction were planted right from the start.
So what was this built-in problem? What was the fatal flaw? Well, Gibbon's answer is surprisingly simple. Immoderate greatness. Basically, Rome got too big for its own good. He believed its decline was, and I quote, the natural and inevitable effect of its own mind-blowing success. You know, prosperity itself is what ripened the principles of decay. It's like this gigantic structure just crumbled under its own weight. And this decay, it wasn't an outside job. It was an inside job. Think about it. The very legions that built the empire, they turned into corrupt mercenaries, basically just plundering their own home. You had emperors who were so paranoid about a military coup that they intentionally weakened their own army's discipline. And then you have the empire itself splitting in two, with a second capital in Constantinople. That just created all this division and rivalry. And here's where it gets really controversial for his time. Gibbon pointed a finger at the rise of Christianity. He argued it siphoned off wealth to the church and preached these virtues of, patience and humility, which he saw as completely at odds with the aggressive, active virtues that had made Rome so powerful in the first place.
Okay, so this is where it gets really fascinating. Gibbon wasn't just some historian dusty in an archive. He was writing for his own time, the 18th century. He looked around at the nations of Europe and saw what he called one great republic. And he was asking a really urgent question. Could this happen to us? Could we suffer the same fate as Rome? So his whole massive work is a warning, for sure. But, and this is the surprising part, it's also packed with a whole lot of optimism.
So why was he so optimistic? Well, his first reason boils down to simple awareness. The Romans, he said, were flying blind. They were facing the seemingly endless column of barbarians pouring out of a vast, unknown world. But Gibbon's Europe? Totally different story.
It was mapped out, it was understood. Barbarianism, as he saw it, had been pushed back to this narrow span, and you had these big, civilized kingdoms like Russia acting as a buffer. The era of the surprise barbarian invasion? Yeah, that was pretty much over.
His next point is a bit of a paradox. He said Rome's biggest strength, its centralized unity, was actually a critical weakness. I mean, the fate of 100 million people could rest on the shoulders of one guy, an emperor who might be totally corrupt or just incompetent. Now contrast that with Gibbon's Europe. It was divided, right? A bunch of competing kingdoms and republics. He saw this as a massive strength. It created a balance of power. It meant that this mutual influence of fear and shame between all these different countries would keep any one ruler from getting too tyrannical.
And finally, let's talk tech. This is a big one. As Roman society decayed, so did its military edge. But Gibbon's Europe had a game-changer the Romans never dreamed of: gunpowder. We're talking cannons, modern fortifications. They created what he called an impregnable barrier. So for any potential conqueror to take on a modern European state, they couldn't just be a horde of warriors anymore. Oh no. They would have to master science, manufacturing, logistics, the whole shebang. As Gibbon so brilliantly put it, before they can conquer, they must cease to be barbarous. You have to become civilized just to have a shot at winning.
But, okay, beyond all the politics, the maps, the military tech, Gibbon had an even deeper, more profound reason for being so confident about the future. He identified this source of hope that he believed was absolutely indestructible.
He pictured human progress as having these three layers. At the very top, the most fragile layer, is rare genius. Think of a Homer or a Newton, one-of-a-kind minds. Then below that, you've got your complex systems, things like laws, trade, government. These are more robust, sure, but as Rome clearly showed, they can absolutely decay and fall apart. But then you get to the bedrock, the foundation, and this is what he called the permanent arts. We're talking about the simple, practical stuff: farming, using fire, working with metals, basic trades. He called these hardy plants that can survive any storm, any disaster. Palaces can fall, empires can crumble, but someone, somewhere, will still know how to plant a field. And that practical knowledge, once it's out there, it can never truly be lost.
And all of this leads him to this powerful, almost shockingly optimistic conclusion, because those hardy plants of basic knowledge are always there, always spreading. He really believed that human progress was, well, unstoppable, that every single generation adds to the pile, increasing the real wealth, the happiness, the knowledge, and maybe even the virtue of the human race. I mean, think about that. That is a seriously radical thing to believe, especially for a guy who just spent thousands of pages documenting the biggest civilizational collapse in history. So, Gibbon was confident. He was sure that his world, his great republic of Europe, was safe and sound. He couldn't imagine a force big enough to undo all that progress he saw. But now, here we are, looking back 2.5 centuries later, after everything we've seen, unimaginable technological leaps, devastating world wars, and totally new kinds of global challenges, you have to ask, right? Was his confidence warranted? Was he a little too optimistic? Or is that bedrock of human knowledge he talked about, is it still holding everything up? Now that's a question to chew on.